Good morning to you all, and thank you for the invitation to address you, actually. I've spent some years now since I left the BBC in trying to illuminate the reality of what the BBC is. I called this talk, How UKIP Can Get a Fair Hearing from the BBC. But I'm not going to tell you that immediately, because that would give you an excuse to leave. So you'll have to hang on till the end before I reveal my cunning plan. When you travel around the world as a BBC reporter, as I did for 25 years, you'll find that the BBC is an organization which is held in enormously high regard in many different countries. And it's a great privilege, actually, to be a BBC reporter. It's a good life. The money's not great, but you meet interesting people, you go to interesting places, and you're dealing with interesting stories. So all in all, it's a pretty fair package. And when I joined the BBC as a young man, after having worked in newspapers, I was very proud to do so. I felt that I was joining the best broadcasting organization in the world, as the BBC bills itself. And I was filled with enthusiasm for the organization. I thought that here at last I'd be able to do an honest job. Well, I have to tell you that it took some years, but eventually the scales fell from my eyes. Because, in fact, the BBC is not the organization which it says it is, nor does it do the job that it says it does. The BBC's whole reputation, as we all know, rests on the notion that it is fair and impartial and balanced in its coverage. And yet, from my personal experience, and I'm sure from yours too, we know that that is not actually the case. There are many strands of opinion in the country, many opinions which are beyond the bounds as far as the BBC is concerned. I sometimes talk about the BBC as the perimeter police of the politically correct compound. And inside the compound, certain things can be talked about, but nothing can be talked about which comes from outside the compound. There are certain areas which you never hear talked about on the BBC, representatives of opinion which are not invited onto the talk shows, which are not invited onto the Today programme, for instance, which was where I spent the last and best years, in many ways, of my career with the BBC. So as I said, I enjoyed my time at the BBC in many ways. It's a very interesting and enjoyable job. So having said that and admitted to you that I was a happy recipient of the privileges that come with working with the BBC, and by that I mean the ability to pick up a phone and ask impertinent questions of virtually anybody that you wish to upbraid. I mean, as a Today programme reporter, there are very few doors which are shut to you. If you're sufficiently interested, you can open a lot of doors just by saying the Today programme is calling. And so I considered that to be a great privilege. So you might wonder why it is that I turned my back on that. I retired in my fairly early 50s and decided to write a book. Kirsten mentioned the first one I wrote, which was Can We Trust the BBC? That was in 2007. I followed that up with another couple, and My latest book came out in November last year called The Noble Liar, the title of which I'll explain to you later. But it does seem on the face of it to be an act of ingratitude to have accepted the BBC's salary checks and the good times that went with it. The reason I did so was because I felt that the whole reputation of the BBC is now resting upon a supposition which is no longer true. The BBC has a very coherent and cohesive political ideology of its own. And this is never stated, but I think that we all can guess what that ideology is. Having worked in the organization, I feel I have a very clear idea of what the ideology consists of. It's easiest to explain what I'm talking about by taking some specific issues. Take Brexit, for instance. I think it's very clear that the BBC has a position which is anti-Brexit. I think the BBC, by and large, detests the idea of leaving the EU. Of course, it can't say publicly that it does, but through its choice of interviewees and its choice of stories that it chooses to tell around the subject, you can tell that the BBC is hostile to the very idea of Britain leaving the EU. It's very obvious to me that the BBC has a neurotic pessimism about Brexit. It feels that Britain's interests, its national interest, can only be served by being part of this supranational organization where decisions are taken not by British people in the interests of British people, but by an organization based in Brussels which is get the interests of many other things, including its own aggrandizement and forward movement. During the referendum campaign itself, the BBC actually acquitted itself fairly well. And the reason for that was that the Representation of the People's Act, which is the Act of Parliament which governs broadcasting during election periods and during referenda, that lays a very strict injunction on broadcasters about the question of balance. So during an election campaign, for instance, BBC editors will actually keep a minute-by-minute record of who says what from which party. And so you actually have a strict balance in terms of time on air from the representatives of the various parties. And that was actually the case during the referendum campaign. So the BBC was obliged to give Leave 50% of the airtime. Now, once we got through the referendum campaign and the referendum was decided, then the BBC went back to its old ways. And if you look at the balance of interviewees, for instance, who have appeared on BBC airwaves since the referendum, you'll find there's a huge imbalance in favor of those who wish to remain. And that gives you a very clear insight, I think, into the BBC's own predilections in the matter. Project Fear has been amplified and consistently promoted by the BBC. So you get every negative or pessimistic forecast as to what's going to happen to the economy is given top billing. Positive news about the economy, of which there has been plenty, tends to get a much lower rating. And in that way, you get, you arouse fear in people, you turn their minds towards what might be the negative consequences of Brexit. Frankly, by the way, I'm actually fairly neutral about the consequences of Brexit. I don't know any more than you know or indeed the BBC knows, or indeed the government knows what the hell's going to happen when we actually leave. It might be a very good thing in terms of the economy. It might not be such a good thing in terms of the economy. I don't think anybody actually can make a sensible prediction about that. But what I do notice is that the BBC is determined to convince us all that actually it's going to be an utter disaster. How they know that, I have no idea. I was listening yesterday morning to my old program, the Today program, and if anyone was listening, you'll know that it was a sort of John Humphrys fest. So they were saying goodbye to John Humphrys as the longest-standing presenter of Today. And towards the end of the program, Tony Hall, Lord Hall, came on. He's the Director General of the BBC, and he said that going forward, the BBC had, as one of its, as part of its mission, a main part of its mission, was to combat so-called fake news. And we've heard a lot about fake news. And this idea of fake news, it fascinates me, because the BBC is endlessly talking about it and the dangers of fake news. And in the BBC's view of the world, fake news can only ever come from one direction. It comes from so-called populists. Populists is the new word for those unspeakable people, the deplorables. Fake news always comes from one direction. They never seem to realize, the penny never seems to drop, that in the eyes of many of us, what the BBC itself produces can be called fake news. Now, and I'm going to explain something which is a hard-won insight from my 40 years as a journalist. So, fake news is often equated with inaccuracy. So there was a famous episode which was surrounding Trump's inauguration in Washington. And the BBC, and indeed other media outfits, the New York Times, I think, was the lead on this. Trump, rather ill-advisedly, said that his inauguration had been the best attended ever, right? So he'd had more people in the Mall in Washington at his inauguration than any other president. And unfortunately, the aerial photographs of his inauguration and other inaugurations proved that that probably was a little bit of a porky, that actually Donald, was guilty there of some exaggeration, shall we say. And the BBC leapt on that. This is what false news, this is what fake news is about. It's about telling untruths, and what is necessary is accuracy. But the point is this, ladies and gentlemen, that news can be entirely accurate, and it can still amount to fake news. This is the crucial point, that I don't doubt that the BBC reports I hear from my ex-colleagues are accurate. I know my ex-colleagues to be men and women of high professionalism. They don't get the facts wrong. The question is, what facts are they choosing to tell? This is the point. If you tell only negative stories about an individual or about an organization or about a political situation, you might be completely accurate, but you're not being fair. And actually, in my view, what that amounts to is faking the news. Because what you do is you present to people an overall story which tells a negative, is a completely negative idea of what this thing is, never giving the other side the proper rejoinder, the proper opportunity to put its side of the case. The BBC does this all the time, and nowhere more obviously and visibly than in its consistent demonization of Donald Trump. Now, I don't have a huge admiration for Trump as a man, but I do think it's very odd that the BBC, from the moment of his election, decided that this was a bad man and that everything that he would do would be bad and evil. And the BBC's coverage of Trump has, in my view, been a journalistic scandal. I think that he has been... I think that he has been portrayed as somebody who is not only wrong, but evil. And whatever you think of Trump, he was democratically elected by the world's most important democracy. And he deserves a fair hearing, which he does not get. So the question arises, why does this happen? And the other thing I have learned from my experience of journalism is this, that journalism, all journalism, is a question of selection. At every stage of the process, there is a decision to be made, a selection to be made. So the first selection is, what story do we cover? Then, which reporter do we send on this story? Then, which of the interviewees that this reporter has talked to do we select? Which elements of what they say, what clips from their speech do we use in the assembled package? And this is true whether you're working in radio or television or newspapers or indeed online. It's all a question of selection. And that is where the underlying bias comes in. Because if you only select stories which, for instance, put Brexit in a bad light, if you only select stories which tell a negative narrative about the consequences of Brexit, then of course, one might be completely accurate in those things, but you're not being fair and you're not being balanced. And I'm afraid that is the conclusion I have arrived at when it comes to the BBC's coverage of so many things. I might say here in passing that I know that Tommy Robinson has been a very divisive figure in this party, as indeed in the country. But some of you may have seen the rather effective and clever sting operation that he did on the Panorama team who went to interview him. Robinson's efforts, which he called Panodrama, rather embarrassingly illustrated the way in which a media organization like the BBC can go about taking down a figure they don't want. It was clear to me watching that, and I've been in teams like that. I have done that sort of long-form journalism for the BBC for various programs. I could just entirely understand and visualize exactly how that was being done. They had set out with a clear intention, which was to blacken Robinson's name. Now look, Tommy Robinson has many things in his past which are not to his credit. So it's not entirely a difficult matter, actually, to paint a negative picture of him. But the way the Panorama team was going about it just showed the kind of underhand and sneaky way they were going to approach that. And I was very interested in that professionally, because I thought if I'd been in the shoes of the Panorama team, I would have been curling up with embarrassment about that. But there has never been any official statement from the BBC, not that I can discover, in relation to that. They've never apologized or explained what was happening in that. And yet, anyone who watches that thing by Tommy Robinson, Panodrama, is left with serious questions about how the BBC goes about its work. So the further question is, why does the BBC operate in this way? It comes down in many ways to the personnel of the BBC. BBC is a large, indeed one of the largest, if not the largest, employer of journalists in the world. It's certainly up there right at the top. And who does it hire? It hires, in the main, very well-educated people, competent people, middle-class people, and also socially liberal people. The real division, as I see it in the country, is between social liberals and social conservatives. And we have not had a socially conservative government in my lifetime, and I'm knocking on 70. But there are an awful lot of social conservatives in the country. Social liberals dominate within the BBC. So what do I mean by a social liberal? Well, the hallmarks of social liberalism are, let's enumerate some of the characteristics of people who would see themselves as social liberals. So they are essentially skeptical about religion, skeptical about nationalism, gung-ho for multiculturalism, fully paid up to the so-called equality agenda, from which the transgender madness all emanates. They are people who reject the idea of an objective morality, and they have a fierce resistance to and often a dislike of established religions, particularly Christianity. They have a soft spot for some other religions, which I suspect is just a way of getting at the historic and traditional religion of this country, which is, our what is good about Britain, what is great about Britain, has stemmed from our adherence to a Christian tradition, which, although it manifests itself in different... I'm so pleased to hear you applaud that, because I think that this is something that we are in danger of losing altogether. This idea that we are a Christian country, and that our political traditions, and indeed our liberal traditions, stem from our previous adherence to a Christian tradition. That our idea of, democracy itself comes from the idea that each individual has self-worth. Each individual deserves the respect of the rest of us, that we all have that human dignity. That idea comes from Christianity. And however much the liberals may detest the idea and will not pay the recognition that deserves, that actually, it is Christianity which has formed this country. And it's important, I think, that we rediscover that and bring that back into the political discourse. So 90%, 95% of people within the BBC are social liberals. I used to make a point when I was working with people. I worked right across the BBC. I worked in Scotland for 6 years. I was an economics correspondent up there. I worked for the Money program, I worked for various political programs, I worked for the Today program, as I've said, and I worked in the general newsroom. And I used to make a point when I was one often works in small, intimate teams, as a broadcast journalist. And I used to make a point of talking about politics, just for the fun of it, because I love doing it anyway, and just discovering where people's political allegiance lay. And I can tell you that I could not have formed a cricket team of right-wingers in all my time in the BBC. I mean, I met plenty of liberals, I met plenty of Marxists, I met plenty of Labour people. Tories, not so much. I mean, I can think of 2 or 3, perhaps, Tories that I met. A UKIP person? I'm afraid not. No, they were very thin on the ground. So, of course, when you've got that sort of political makeup in an organization, which, of course, is self-perpetuating, because when these people sit on appointment boards, hiring new people, they look for people like themselves. I mean, it's just, we all do it. I mean, let's be honest. This is not a deformation that the BBC alone suffers from. We all want to work with people we feel comfortable with and think like we do, and that's the way the thing is perpetuated. And that is why the ranks of the BBC are stuffed full of social liberals and actual Labour Party members, and there isn't anyone else. Because, that's just the way the system works. And that's what you've got to recognize when you're dealing with the BBC. This is what you are actually up against. You're up against an organization which has a view of the world which is not shared by 100% of the population. Maybe 40% of the population, maybe 50% of the population. They it is who command the heights within broadcasting. And this matters because when the BBC puts its weight behind a campaign, that has enormous leverage on the rest of us. Do you know, it's still the case that more than 90% of us each week connect with or use at least one BBC service. I mean, that is a huge, when you think about it, that is a more intimate connection with more people in the country than any other organization. More than the NHS, and it's something which is there in their homes. Often it's on, almost 24 hours a day sometimes. People take the radio to the bathroom, they watch the telly. The BBC has a huge impact. It's easily the most important media organization in the country. So when the BBC throws its weight behind a campaign, as I believe it has done in the question of the equality agenda, particularly pertaining to transgenderism. This far-out theory, which emanated from, wouldn't you know it, a Californian feminist academic, which throws into question one of the basic aspects of our humanity, has been taken up by the BBC and is now a staple of their output. And what this does, it is a transgressive thing. It undermines, particularly in young people, their sense of who they are, something which ought to be fundamental to children. It gives them another reason to be anxious in those difficult years between 12 and 18, when you're going through all those hormonal changes. Now they're being told, you've got to decide whether you're whether you're a boy or a girl. I mean, it's a cruel kind of madness. And had I been in charge of the BBC, or had people like me been in charge of the BBC, the right thing to have done about transgenderism would have been to ignore it. Which is not to say that we should persecute transgenders people, because that would be cruel and unnecessary and out of keeping with our liberal traditions in the country, the best liberal traditions in the country, which is that people, can lead their own lives in the way that they want to. And I'm not objecting to that. I think that is absolutely central to the British character. So, what is so wrong about the way the BBC currently is this, that the BBC is paid for by us all, and its solemn covenant with us as licence fee payers and indeed as citizens is this, that, okay, we all have to pay for it. And the promise on the other side is that they will be fair, that all strands of opinion will get a fair hearing. After all, we all pay for it, therefore we all have a right, actually, to have our own views reflected back to us. And that is where the covenant has broken down. The BBC, in my view, consistently ignores this solemn covenant, that it has never given a fair hearing to certain groups within society. It has never given a fair hearing to social conservatives, those people who, like me, think we should return to some of the old moral certainties which once used to be a given in society. They've certainly never given a fair hearing to people like UKIP. They have always been very loath to explore what you are about and what your policies are about and what you want to do. So, to come back to the starting point, how should UKIP get a fair hearing from the BBC? How can you get a fair hearing from the BBC? So, I'd say it's quite simple, really. All you have to do is change what you believe, change what you think. In fact, a good start would be to change your name. I suggest something like maybe, I don't know, something with liberal in it, maybe? Something which, was more in keeping with what the BBC believes in its heart. So I know that's a slightly flippant note on which to end, but I do honestly think that the BBC will never actually give UKIP or any other party like UKIP a fair hearing. And I think that is to its eternal discredit. Thank you.